Okay, so I'm going to go over it's kind of a soft introduction to reactive programming with observables. And I'm going to do that by going over an example by using a Typeahead. So some of you have seen this before. This is a diagram of how you handle single and multiple values synchronously or asynchronously. So we all know all these things already, getting values off objects, arrays, and promises. But have you ever thought about how you handle multiple things asynchronously? Well, in reactive programming, you can use something called an observable. And so that's what I'm going to explain here. So what is an observable? An observable is simply a container that holds a value that can change over time. And you could subscribe to this and do some action. So at one point in time, it has 10. I can subscribe to it and console log it. And as time goes on, it'll keep console logging all the values that get put on this container. So that's what an observable is. It's just things you can watch on a container that change over time. But like I said, the observable, you use it for multiple values. So if you think about all the values that could be on this observable over its entire lifetime, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, you could run a lot of array-like functions on this. So for example, I can map over it and triple all the values. If you don't recognize that, that's an ES6 fat arrow function. X is the input, X times 3 is the return value. And you could chain more calls, so I could filter out all of the odd numbers. And there's a whole bunch of other methods like debounce, merge, scan, and some other ones down there. And honestly, there's like 200 other ones. If you go to RxJS, their GitHub page, they have the API. It's just ridiculous how many methods they have on observables. And so I want to show an example. This is a Typeahead. And so if I type, CKO, it's going to look up GitHub user IDs. So if I start to look up mine, okay, there's me. So this is multiple asynchronous events because these are keyboard events, and they're asynchronous because you don't know when they're going to happen. Or I can start typing someone else, MMA, C, lots of vowels. There's no E's in there, apparently. Fun fact. So that's a Typeahead. And so I'm going to show you a neat idea that CycleJS introduced me to, and I want to share it with you guys. So let's say hypothetically you have an observable with a bunch of events on it, and they're keyboard press events. And let's say you could run these events through some kind of transformation, and out on the back end, you get virtual DOM. So just bear with me for a minute and just hold this idea in your head. Let's see what that would look like with the Typeahead I had there. So I type CKOST, and I pause briefly after the C and after the O, and that produces an observable with 5 different key down events. And ultimately, I want to produce HTTP requests, but I don't want 5. I want to debounce those, so maybe I only do like 3, depending on how I tweak that 250 millisecond parameter. But an observable of events doesn't really help me that much, so I can map over that and get the target element's value. So now I have what the input box had on my observable, and at which point I can subscribe to and produce HTTP requests. I realize that's not what that code does, but just pretend it does for a moment. So now I'm generating a whole bunch of HTTP requests, or 3 in this example, and I'm about to get a whole bunch of HTTP responses. So that is multiple asynchronous things. So we're going to use an observable again to handle those. So I get 3 HTTP responses. Let's say that first one was a failure, and so I could filter over that and just do kind of a happy path thing and only handle these successful responses. The responses don't really help me, so I could drill down into that response and turn it into an observable of users, at which point I could map again one more time and say for each one of those users, create virtual DOM and create an observable of those things. And at that point, you could just hand it to whatever virtual DOM capable framework and just say, here, here's an observable of virtual DOM, and just let it update the DOM for you. And so that's what this example is, and this is CycleJS. This is CycleJS. Can you read that okay back there on the couch? Yes. So in the slides I showed there are 2 observables. There was one for the input box. So I say, hit the DOM, find the search box, and produce an observable based on key press events, debounce it, turn it from an observable of events into values, and then ultimately we're producing an observable of objects that represent an HTTP request. So we're not actually generating a request, we're just creating descriptions of that request. So that is on line 7 there, the search stream variable. And we go down here and say, hey, CycleJS, here's an observable of HTTP requests. Just go generate the request for me because I'm not going to do that. CycleJS is more than happy to do that, and it will give you an HTTP object when you first in your main method there. So at that point, and that was that last slide I showed, we can get that HTTP response object, filter out the bad responses, turn it into an observable of users, but actually not an observable of users. What we could actually do from there is turn it into an observable of virtual DOM. And this is just the DOM that I showed you earlier. There's a container with a search input box and an unordered list of users' results. So as a result of that, we have an observable of virtual DOM. Again, we give that to CycleJS and say, here's an observable of virtual DOM. You figure out how to update the DOM, and I'm done. And that's it. And that is the entire example here. I mean, there's 2 imports at the top, some boilerplate at the bottom, but that's it. There's no callbacks, there's no promises, there's no set timeout, clear timeout, because that's what you might have to do to help throttle things if you weren't using observables. What else is there? No digest cycles, no jQuery updating the DOM. It's just, this entire example is just create 2 observables. One is input to requests, one is responses to DOM. So I thought that was a neat example of how to handle asynchronous things, and that's why I wanted to share it with everyone. So that's all I had to share. Are there any questions on this example for reactive programming? Yeah.
I mean, I like the terseness of it, but I guess how it fits together, maybe that just CycleJS stuff. It's hard for me to see where things kick off. And
sure. So RxJS, I didn't really draw the lines very well. RxJS is what produces the observable construct. CycleJS takes those RxJS observables and plugs them into other libraries, like a virtual DOM library or HTTP request library or an audio library. And so CycleJS gets its name because it's how do I go from the user to producing, taking inputs into state, and how do I get state produced back to visually for the user. And so there's a free Egghead video that I would recommend if you're curious on CycleJS.
Any other 2 is utilizing RxJS for all the observables as well. So, a lot of benefits to learn it.
All right, if there's no other questions, I'll go to Schulte then. Thanks.